good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome back to another episode as we rebuild our OpenSAP HANA 7 course for the latest capabilities of SAP HANA Cloud and the newest versions of the Cloud Application Programming Model. We've built quite an application up to this point. We've seen pretty extensive development of our database model, service enablement, creating our own custom service endpoints. And in last week's episode, we even added WebSockets and started playing around with the user interface a little bit. We primarily created a user interface in order to test our WebSockets, just a simple little SAP UI 5 freestyle application. But this week's episode, we really want to concentrate more on building the user interface, and in particular using Fiori Annotations in our CDS model to generate a user interface using Fiori elements. And we can start with just the Cloud Application Programming Model preview capabilities. So here I am in the root of my project, and if I go ahead and run CDS run, and of course it will launch, and then we'll open it in another tab. We've seen this before, but let's start by concentrating on our master data service. We have addresses, business partners, and products in particular, three we're going to look at. When I run these out of the box with the basic service and the modeling we've done, we've only really done the bare bones Fiori elements. Annotations. We've done just enough annotations in most cases to define language-dependent column header or description for each element, but we have not done any of the UI specific, the rest of the UI specific elements. So when we run the Fiori elements preview for addresses, for instance, we get a user interface, but it's telling us there are no columns visible in our table. That's because there's not even any basic annotations to tell it what should be on a list view and what should be on an object page. Those help tell the Fiori elements how to create the user interface. And yes, we can go in and manually use the configuration options to add columns. We have enough annotations that we're getting a column description, but that's about it. That's all we're getting here as far as our user interface. And even if I go ahead and add a few things here, city, street, country, and then say go, then we do get data, but there's no further navigation because we don't have any annotations to say what the object page, when we navigate from our list into a single record, that should go from a list page to an object page, but we don't have any annotations to tell Fiori elements how to handle that, just like we didn't have any to tell it what our default fields were, and we're not getting any filter fields. We're not getting any fields by default to search on. We'd have to go in and add those as well. But by adding annotations to our model, we can begin to build this Fiori Elements UI. Even though this is a generic preview, it's going to read those annotations that will appear in our metadata document and dynamically adapt the user interface to it. I started to say generate, but that isn't really what it's doing. It doesn't generate a fixed UI. It constantly adapts at runtime to whatever it sees are your metadata annotations. So now we'll return to our project and we'll start adding some of these annotations. Now, if you remember back to when we did our database modeling, you'll probably remember that we even embedded some annotations here within the base data model. But at this point already, I was already separating things out. For instance, I create the address entity, but even the title annotation, I don't embed within the address itself. Instead, I say annotate address with, and just keep even the base annotations separate. Now, we could begin adding Fiori UI annotations at this level as well and annotate the low-level base entity. But I think you'll find that in most best practices and SAP examples, we further separate that out. And we actually remove the UI annotations and we don't even make them part of the data model because we don't want them to automatically be part of every service that uses this entity. We might want to have different services and maybe multiple UIs for a single service and separate out the UI specific annotations into separate files. So a single entity might have different annotations depending upon different UI or different service use cases. So for the most part, other than like the really low level field descriptions, which aren't going to change based upon use case, and a few other instances, and I don't even think we have too many. Yeah, we did some base annotation. We did some UI annotations here in some of these base elements, but that was at the view level, and we knew how they were going to be used. But for the most part, there are little to no annotations in the base model until we get down here to products, where we did want to configure value help, basically input and output parameters for value help on this products table. We'll come back and maybe look at that in a little more detail once we've seen how that impacts the UI. Right now it doesn't because we haven't built up any rest of the UI. But basically we wanted some, we knew there were some things even about the UI that we wanted to build in at the lowest level of the data model, like how we handle value help or value list. Sometimes personally, I will mix that in at my base data model if I know that I want that to be inherited wherever this entity is being used. But for the most part, what we want to do to begin to build our master data annotations is I'm going to come here to the service module. Now I could also put this in the app module. Some people, I see this, because it is UI specific, they'll actually separate it out and put it in with the rest of the UI. Maybe this is a matter of personal preference. I kind of like to have it in my SRV module, just because I like to keep my app module purely for the Fiori elements, just projects. Like I said, matter of personal preference there, though. I think technically it works either way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another file. I'm not even going to add it into my service, but I'm going to call this file MD Fiori for master data Fiori. So it's going to be Fiori specific annotations for the master data entities and the master data service. And I'm just going to create that as a CDS file. And what we're going to do here is I need to import something existing. And I'm actually going to start with the service in this case. So, like I said, there's a bit of hierarchy here. There's some inheritance going on. And I want to define Fiori annotations that are going to be used specifically just for this master data service. Because if you remember in my service CDS, I've got a master data service and I've got a PO service. The master data service is where things like address, employees, business partners, where we have full CRUD operations, where we can create a new business partner. My PO service, though, has some of the master data entities in them, but they are read-only. So what I want to do is these Fiori elements that I'm going to define here via the annotations in this MD Fiori are going to be specific to the master data service, which means I want to create a UI to maintain, to be able to do create, update, and delete on some of these master data entities. So that's why I'm going to start by using the master data service. And that does mean that the annotations that I define here in my service are only going to be applied to the metadata document of just this one service, the master data service. Even though we have two services that have some of the same entities within this single endpoint. So let's go ahead and add one here. Addresses. Let's just start with addresses. And I'm going to do some cut and paste here. You definitely don't want to watch me type all this. But I'm saying annotate the master data service addresses entity with, now this is very similar to the way that we set up the initial entities, where we define what I would say is a clean entity with no annotations, entity addresses, just the data definitions, and then we say annotate addresses with. Here we are further saying annotate addresses, but now it's just the version of the entity that is exposed as part of the master data service. So we'll get a layering and an inheritance. So all the annotations that I attached here, all the titles, I don't need to repeat those. Those are all going to be inherited from the base model. But now I can begin to layer things on top of that are going to be more UI specific. And I'm going to start with my list report annotations. So what I'm doing in this section is I'm defining which attributes, which columns in the table or the entity I want to be exposed whenever this entity is used as part of a Fiori list. So that first screen in the preview, that's what we call a list, when we list all the records in a table or an entity. And for the most part, this is relatively straightforward. I say UI, and I'm creating a line item. That's each record, and I list which columns that I want. So I'm saying city, for instance. So I'm going to take address, and I'm going to say city, and that's the order that it should then appear in. And all these are data fields, so just going to be regular data fields. We'll see a little bit later. We can change the UI element type that Fiori Elements uses to render the field, but 90% of the time you're probably using just plain data field. The other thing you'll notice here is I don't list a specific like 1, 2, 3, 4. I list a UI importance, and that's to help with an adaptive UI. So what I'm really saying here is I want the line item to have city, street, region, and country name. We'll come back to that in a second. But what I wanted to do is, as long as there's enough space on the screen, it should list all 4. But let's say there's only enough space to list 3 of the columns, then it will list the 3 high priority columns and drop off the medium. And we can have high, medium, low. And it allows us to build a UI that automatically adapts to different devices without having to deal with screen resolutions and specific positions and things like that. Everything's relative, and let the Fiori front end decide at runtime how it renders the screen based upon the technical requirements that it sees. Now we also see here country name. In the original entity, there is no country name. There is a country, and it has an association to SAP common countries. But what we want to do is we don't want to show the country code in the user interface. We want to show the country description. And this is pretty common in your user interface. You want to follow that association, and you want to display something from the target of the association. This is where the annotations are so powerful and so easy to use. I don't have to worry about the annotation or how to navigate it. I don't have to tell the user interface, what the relationship is, what the URLs are for any of that. I just say, oh, I've got an attribute that is country, that's actually an association, dot, and then the attribute name from the target of that association. And Fiori will figure out all the technical how-tos of how to do an expand or do a navigate into that association in order to fill that column at runtime. We don't have to worry about any of that. We just use the annotations logically here with the dot syntax. In addition to listing which columns will appear in the output, we can also adjust the sort order. So I'm going to automatically build in a sort by ID and then city. Now, while we're in here, we'll also go ahead and create an object page, so that when you select a particular record, then it will take you to a detailed page for just that one record. And this is a little bit more complex because instead of just the line item, here we get a couple of different sections. We're going to have a header info section, and we have the ability to also have facets within there, like groups of fields, and group them together logically and visibly. We'll see that in the UI here in a minute. And what I'm doing here is just telling you which fields to appear. Yes, I want the ID. I want the city. Here in the second field group with all the details, I want to show a street, postal code. I'm going to do the country code, but then I'm also going to do the country name once again via the association. But notice now, once I'm to an object page, this could be open for change as well, or create. And I need to mark this column because it's coming from an association. I don't want to update the name of a country. I only want to be able to input the country code. So I need to say that that is read-only. Then we have the administrative data, valid from, valid to. That's pretty straightforward. And then we can say how we want to arrange the facets inside the page and give them labels and relationships to one another. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and save what we have. Do a CDS build so that these annotations will now be rendered into our OData service, and then do a CDS run. What we should be able to see, now if we even look at the metadata of the document, already this is going to be expanded. This is where the annotations get rendered into. So for instance, let's come here and let's look for line item. This would not have been in our OData metadata before, but now we're getting annotation sections, UI line item, our fields, our importance, basically exactly what we defined here for the line item, which columns and UI importance. That's all being rendered into the metadata document, so it can be interpreted at runtime by the user interface. So let's go ahead, and we also see some other, well, we'll come back to that. That's outside of our addresses. We've only done addresses so far, so let's go ahead and have a look at that in the Fiori Elements preview. So now when we come to addresses and we look at it in the preview, what we should get, instead of the blank page that we got the first time, we should get more information off the bat. Yeah, see, now right away, I get city, street, region, name. Well, that's exactly what we defined here. City, street, region, country name. And when I go ahead and run this, now you're seeing city, street, region, name. Name wasn't even an option before when we did the configuration. It was only added because we pulled it in via that association navigation. And without adding that to the annotations specifically, that would have never been there in the default display there. We can also see our sort configuration, that it has, it should have already set up the sort for us. We didn't add any filters on this one, so we didn't get any filters dynamically are brought in by default, but we're starting small here with just the addresses. But most importantly, now I've got the little navigation link, which will take me from the list page to the object page. We did not have that at all before because we didn't have enough annotations. And now when we come here, we see the header information. That's this all gets into the facets of the object page. So we said we wanted a header information, and it was going to have, what all did we say here? We were going to have the ID and the city. Here's our ID. Here's our city. We have our valid from and our valid to. And then the rest of the details here, that's our second field group. Well, that's coming down here in this section of the screen. And we still have our country name as well as our country code. Yeah, so we're building up. We have delete. We don't have edit in this case. If we generate a full UI, we would have the ability to go into edit mode and even edit this data. But look how much we've gotten out of a UI with just the generic preview. We haven't generated a UI. We haven't ran a UI wizard or anything like that yet. This is just with our Fiori, our generic preview tool in the cloud application programming model and what it's interpreting just by adding annotations. So that is our address annotations. We've had a look at that. While the video was paused, I added some more annotations into my file. I have completed the business partners as well. Not wildly different on the business partner, but the main thing that I want to showcase here is the fact that you can walk through many different associations. In this case, business partner has an association to address. The address had an association to country, and then country had an association to name. Now that would be fairly complex if we had to build the whole expand statement ourselves or navigate through all those relationships. But as you can see here, we can just address.country.name, and once again, Fiori and the client side is going to figure out all of that for us. So let's go ahead and look at that one. Let's just do CDS build to make sure I've got all of my changes in my metadata. And we'll do a CDS run. Shouldn't have to rerun this again because I put a bunch of changes in here and we'll look at them a little at a time. So now when we look at the business partners and we look at it in the Fiori preview, and we say go, there we have our country name. So this country name is coming through all these levels of associations here. That our business partner had an address association, which had an association to country based upon country code, and then we get the name of the country. So we're following all those leads here to get that name. If you want to see what that actually looks like, let's just go ahead and open the developer tools. Let's do a refresh here. Oh, that's going to take a little bit. I have it set to disable cache when I have the developer tools open. So, yeah, it's going to take a second or so longer to load all of the UI libraries. I'm actually going to disable that so we can just do demos here. And when we say go, and it's loading our data. If we look at this batch request, this is what's making the OData request to the server side. And if we look at the request, that's the response that's coming back. The what we want is the request header. You notice it's doing a get business partners, count true. It's telling you what columns to select, so it's only selecting the columns that we know that are going to be visible in our output, driven by our annotations. Notice the expand address, and select ID valid from there. And then within the expand of the address, we're then inner expanding country, and selecting code and name from there. And the rest is navigation within the trees. Skip 0, top 30. If we scroll through the table, we would see these increment. So all this complex expansion of the associations, all built into the request for us automatically. So quite nice. And actually, while I had I'll reopen the developer tools. That was a good example of the adaptive UI. Well, that's a little ridiculous there, but if we as we give it less or more screen space, and we can simulate what this would look like in different devices here, you can see how it automatically adjusts the UI to get as many elements as it can logically on the screen, and how to adjust for the having to deal with the low, medium, high that we asked for. There's the iPhone X, what it would look like. iPad Pro. Well, now we're getting to more of a near desktop experience. That's a little big. Let's go to 75. There we are. And we see what that looks like. So this is a great way to be able to test and see what the adaptive UI is going to do on different devices. Ooh, the iPhone 5. That's pretty old. That's really small resolution there, isn't it? But yeah, so that's a great little tip to check out. So let's go back. What else did we add here? So that was the business partners. I'm not going to go through all the annotations again. A lot of this is the same. I'm going to point out when things are particularly interesting here. Here's the products master data. Let's see, what do we have here? I think we'll have to come back to this one. Yes, there's some associations on currency, partner company name instead of showing the partner ID itself. That's always interesting. The administrative data, we're going straight to the created by. We'll see that in a second, but I don't think there's anything particularly. If I come here to products, we'll get in the Fiori UI. The part that we're setting up here that I think is going to be interesting eventually is this product image. And it doesn't work yet. That's what we're going to come back to and look at next week. So we'll start with the basic annotations we have here. But I want to show you how we can load the product images. But that's through a different set of annotations and a little extra setup that we'll do in next week's episode. But otherwise, this is pretty straightforward. I don't even think, if we go to the next page, you see the created by, it's expanding the association there and showing the email address of the created by, and of course not the codes. See the company names, the descriptions. This is all pretty straightforward. I don't think there's anything terribly new there yet. The last part that I want to show you for today's episode, so I also created annotations for the purchase order. Now this is a little bit more interesting because if we come to the service CDS for the purchase order entity specifically, it has create, update, change capabilities on it, and we're using OData draft. So we're going to get to see the impact that has on our UI. We also have a real deeply nested association here because we got a PO header, and then for each PO header we have one or more items, and that's all going to play out here in our UI now that we've built the UI annotations. So what we're able to do here is starting with the PO header, and we're annotating that very much like what we've seen so far. We're going to have a line item that's going to for our list report. That's going to be the list of purchase orders. But we're going to do things like expand the partner to show the company name and not just the partner ID, the currency symbol instead of just the currency code. But otherwise, that's not really all that different than what we've seen either. Now, when we go to the object page, this is where things get a little bit more interesting because we're going to start with the object page. And yes, we're going to do things like the partner and the partner ID. Display the company name of the partner as read-only. But where this gets very interesting is not the administrative data. That's more of the same, basically. But when we get into the items here, or when we get into the page facets, we'll see that in addition to items, we're going to navigate into the item as well. So one of the facets on our detailed page will actually be, we want it to be a table of the items. So what we do is we tell it to navigate into the item association for the PO header, but then use the UI line item. So we're building a list report within our object page is what we're telling it to do. And then we can just go ahead and annotate the PO items as well with a list report, line item list, and also give it its own object page. So let's see what this looks like now. I mean, it's a little abstract here when we're looking at the annotations. I think where this really comes together is now let's just see what this does. So we'll go into the Fiori Preview for the purchase orders. And what you see here, so far, not all that different. If I go ahead and run this, we're going to get a list. Yes, all our purchase order items, company name, gross amount, currency symbol. Notice we have create now, and if I were to select an item, we would have delete as well. We also have the draft support. So we can make changes and we can save them as drafts, and then we can come back and only we would see our own drafts. We can see a record is locked if it's in a draft editing mode, unsaved changes by other users. So you got the ability to see all these different editing statuses, which I don't have any of those other statuses right now. We'll just leave it right here at all. But what we really want to do is now we want to see the impact that having that deep association and embedding a list annotation within our object page has. And we'll see that right away if we come here and we navigate into the first record. What we're going to see is we have the different facets. So we've got a header facet, and it's got our header details with company name and created by, changed by. It hasn't been changed yet, has it? And then if we go to the details, yeah, here's the rest of the details for the purchase order, the partner ID, the gross amount, the currency, things like that. Now we got a whole nother list in here. We've got a purchase order items list. And each of these, we can create a new item here at this level. We can delete one at this level. We can navigate into a third level, which gives us the object page for that one particular item if we want to be adding it. And once again, we got all this dynamically just by how we structured our annotations. You know, we've gone from a very simple, just a list report with a single set of annotations to now we're building transactional applications that have multiple levels to them, parent-child levels, and we can add items at these different levels. What we also see here, if I navigate back, we've got value help as well. If I come here to the partner ID and I do the drop to the value help, it doesn't just show us a list of the GUIDs for the partners. I'm seeing the company names as well. And I have the ability to search by other criteria. I can say search by the partner role, or search by the email address or legal form. Or the currency. This one's interesting because now I've got another value help for the currency code. These were the value helps and the annotations that we defined at the base data model level because we wanted them to carry all the way through regardless of how the application was defined. But what we're seeing here is we have this on the partner ID for the purchase order. If we would go back to, I think what we would see, if we come here to purchase order CDS and we look at when we annotate the header of the entity itself. So this isn't the PO Fiori that has all the UI annotations with the line item and the object page. This is the original entity definition, and then right away we annotated that entity definition. And you notice when we brought in the partner attribute or partner column, I added and we added an annotation here for common value list. And basically I'm saying, well, here's the entity that you should go use for value help, business partners. I map the input and output parameters that the partner ID, the unique ID, is what should come in and out. But what I want to display in addition to that is the company name. Well, this right here, this block of annotation, I'm building the value help. If you go back to ABAP, when you build a search help, you define the input and output criteria, input and output columns, and the display columns. That's exactly what I'm doing here, except I'm just doing it in the annotations. And that's precisely what got generated here when I come to the partner ID. It's those specific annotations that said, well, partner ID is what is the input parameter, partner ID is what is the output parameter, and company name should also display. I could have added other columns to the display here if I wanted as well. So we're seeing very complex capabilities here. You know, the fact that I got the same thing with the currency. I built that value help in at a low level, show the currency code in name, but there's other search criteria here, like I can search on the currency symbol if I wanted. And all this is beginning to come together into a pretty robust UI. Here we have a date timestamp value help. And the same thing here on the product. The product value help. Here's a value help that I defined where I wanted the unique ID, I wanted the product category, and I wanted the product name to be displayed as well. So we can customize our value helps. That's exactly what I've done here with just using annotations and just the generic preview. If we want to change something here, let's just change something very minor. And I'll actually, it's saving the draft now. So saved my draft state of this. And let's actually exit out. What we should see now, if that persisted the draft, I should be able to see my draft. Yes, so I see I have this one record in draft. So I could have left, gone to lunch, come back, and even though I haven't saved this, it hasn't committed it to the database. I've now got my draft state, just my unchanged, my uncommitted, if you will, changes, but still persisted for me. And at some point, I can go ahead and save, and then this becomes the real version of the record. Then I no longer would have a draft. Yep, see my draft is gone. And that's all supplied by CAP and the Fiori elements, doing all the logic to handle the different editing states and the draft states and all that good stuff as well. And with that, it brings us to the end of another episode. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this pretty deep dive into the UI annotations portions of modeling in the cloud application programming model and the power of what we can do with Fiori elements. So far, all we've used is the preview. Of course, this isn't persisted. This isn't our UI that we could then deploy. This just lets us test our annotations. Now that we've got a pretty good set of annotations, in next week's episode, what we want to do is use those annotations to really walk through the Fiori Elements wizard and generate an application off of these annotations. What you'll see is those full-blown Fiori Elements applications will even give us more capabilities than what we've seen here. And it will give us the opportunity to also loop back and do some of the things like take care of the URL for the image, the product image that we saw today that was just like a placeholder. We'll go ahead and finish that off in next week's episode as well.